The 2020 U.S. election, well, it gave us some really fascinating, sometimes quite surprising, shifts in how people voted. It's like this complex puzzle, you know? Each piece tells you something new about the American electorate.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to do a deep dive into three specific groups: Indigenous people, ethnic minorities, and suburban white women. We want to unpack how they shaped the 2020 outcome, particularly favoring Biden, by looking at, well, their past voting patterns and what really drove their decisions this time around.
Absolutely. And I think setting the stage is key here. You had these broad influences, like the previous administration's, let's say, rhetoric and actions towards certain communities, and then layered on top the massive impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. These were really central catalysts.
Right.
But it's also crucial, like you said, to remember the diversity within these groups: age, gender, religion. They're not monolithic blocks at all.
That's such an important point to keep in mind as we go. Okay, so let's start with Indigenous people. We saw some really compelling movement there in 2020. Voter turnout really jumped compared to 2016. They played a surprisingly critical role in swinging the election, it seems.
The numbers are quite striking. Indigenous voters went for Biden by about 57% in 2020. Now, that's up from 51% in 2016, which is a noticeable increase.
Okay.
Historically, yes, Indigenous voters often lean more liberal, identify more with the Democrats, but this 2020 surge, it felt like something more.
A 6-point jump, that's significant. So what was the main driver? What really pushed that increase in that shift towards Biden?
Well, the number one reason cited in exit polls, it was the perceived lackluster response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay.
For Indigenous communities, which, have often faced historical underfunding in healthcare, emergency services, the pandemic response really hit home. It became less about abstract politics and more, well, deeply personal, a real mobilizing force.
That makes sense. And you can see a concrete example in Arizona, right? Efforts to boost turnout there led to, I think it was a 116% increase in Apache County. That's huge. It's an area where two major reservations overlap.
Exactly.
And there was that detail about the failed lawsuit, too, the one seeking more time for mail-in ballots from reservations.
Yeah.
It seems like that almost backfired on those trying to suppress the vote and ended up galvanizing people instead.
It really did. And this wasn't just an Arizona story. That same pattern, higher turnout, stronger Democratic leaning, we saw it elsewhere. Think Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, even Hawaii.
Interesting.
And beyond the pandemic, you also had the rhetoric from the Trump administration. That was often seen as dismissive of tribal sovereignty or insensitive.
Yeah.
And that definitely played a role in turning off many Indigenous voters as well. It reinforced the shift.
So specific factors like the pandemic response, coupled with rhetoric, really moved the needle for Indigenous voters. But, okay, let's switch gears because the shifts weren't always so straightforward, were they? Our next group, ethnic minorities, actually presents some findings that challenge, well, some common assumptions.
That's right. This was one of the really surprising takeaways from 2020. Even though Trump lost the election, he actually got more support from ethnic minorities overall compared to 2016 when he won.
Wait, really? More support in defeat than in victory from those groups?
Exactly. It forces you to, look a bit closer and question those broad stroke assumptions about voting blocks.
Okay, so break that down. What kind of increases are we talking about?
Well, the data showed something like a 6% increase among Black men voting for Trump and about a 5% increase among Black women, plus significant growth from Latino women, too.
Those aren't trivial numbers. That's substantial movement.
Definitely not trivial. And you can see a specific example down in Florida in Miami-Dade County. Democratic support there actually dropped noticeably, shifting towards Republicans between 2016 and 2020.
Okay, so what was the reasoning there? According to the sources, why did some minority voters move towards Trump?
Well, the sources suggest that some Black, Hispanic, and other minority voters felt persuaded by what they described as promises kept. Things like economic policies, maybe, or stances on social issues, particularly for more socially conservative, religious voters within these communities.
Interesting. So economic factors and social conservatism playing a bigger role than maybe anticipated.
It points to a much more nuanced picture, certainly, not just a simple racial or ethnic group vote. It's more complex.
Okay, really important nuance there. Now, let's pivot to another really key group, perhaps the most talked about battleground, suburban white women. You probably remember Donald Trump directly appealing to them, saying things like "just like me," and painting this picture of suburbs under siege.
Oh, absolutely. That rhetoric was very prominent. And this group is so significant because, well, they turned out to be the single biggest bloc of voters to actually abandon Trump between 2016 and 2020.
The biggest bloc to leave him.
That's what the data suggests. It wasn't just a small shift. It looks like a fundamental realignment for a group once considered pretty reliably Republican.
Let's put some numbers on that for you listening because it really tells the story. In 2016, Trump won suburban voters overall, narrowly, 47% to 45% against Clinton.
Right.
But by the 2018 midterms, you could see erosion. His support dropped to 45% versus 52% for Democrats among suburbanites.
The warning signs were there.
And then in 2020, the dam really broke.
Yeah.
Among suburban white women specifically, 54% voted for Biden, only 45% for Trump.
Yeah, that's a 9-point gap, a
Wow.
really stark reversal from 2016.
So what happened? What drove such a significant change?
Well, the thinking is that Trump's perception of the suburbs, the one he projected, might have been, well, frankly, dated.
Dated how?
Modern suburbs just seem to be much more diverse now. Diverse in terms of people, but also diverse in their political views and concerns. And it seems like that constant out-of-touch approach, maybe overplaying crime fears or ignoring the changing demographics.
Didn't resonate.
Exactly. It seems it turned off a lot of these voters.
Wow.
They didn't see the reality reflected in his message, and that pushed them towards Biden.
So a mismatch between the political narrative and the lived reality of the suburb.
It appears that way, yeah. It shows how perceptions can lag behind the actual evolution of communities.
Okay, so putting it all together,
Yeah.
it's clear these shifts, sometimes in unexpected directions, really paint a picture of a very dynamic American electorate. You have Indigenous voters mobilized by specific issues like the pandemic response and rhetoric. Then you have these surprising counterintuitive gains for Trump among some segments of ethnic minorities.
Right.
And finally, this really significant defection of suburban white women away from Trump. It's complex.
It absolutely is. And it illustrates just how multifaceted and, frankly, unpredictable modern American elections can be. No single narrative fits all.
Which brings us to a final thought, perhaps something for you to mull over.
Yeah, how do these specific shifts we've talked about, these documented changes in voter behavior, how do they challenge or maybe even confirm some of our broader assumptions about political alignment? And looking forward, what might this tell us about how political campaigns might need to adjust their strategies and priorities in the future?